Good afternoon. This is Sandy Baird from the Voices of Vermont to introduce subjects that are interesting to all of us, both local and statewide, and also international. We have guests today who will talk about these important issues: city budget, views about the marathon that just happened, D-Day, June 6th, 1944.
Like it just happened yesterday.
What?
Feel like it just happened
It
yesterday.
didn't, though, Steve. We're old, as you know. It happened how many years ago? 80? Is that right?
75, I think.
75 years ago. And we have as our guest Steve Goodkind. We have Pete Garitano. And we also have me to comment on June 6th on Normandy Day. We'll begin, though, with Steve Goodkind, who was the former director of public works in our city. He's been following the finances of the city with some diligence for a very long time. And he's been also following the new mayor and the budget that she has proposed, and also the things that she has discovered about the budget and about our city, including the school budget, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so begin, Steve. What's going on?
Much more enjoyable to follow the new mayor than the old mayor.
Well, for you, there are people who
certainly.
would rather have followed Moreau, I'm
Sure.
sure. I saw him in the market the other day.
Is
And
he buying? He's vegan, I think. He wouldn't be buying much.
Is he a vegan?
I think he is.
okay, anyway, but he was with his daughter, and he looked remarkably relaxed. And I asked him how he was doing, and he said he was glad to be not mayor anymore. So
He
there
and
you
I
go.
we can agree on that.
No,
We're
I know.
both glad that he's not
I
mayor.
know, but that's
awesome.
not
And I feel good for
fair.
him. Well, it's good for him. If he's out of it,
Yes, but
Should
but
be out of it.
you
That's
also, I mean, it was really, really hard these past 2 years on him, and so we wish him well always.
I'm glad if he's done well and he's enjoying it and his
He
daughter
seems to
can
be.
see him once in a while instead of him being always, mayor's a busy job. Whether you do it
I
well or
know
not,
that.
it's a
I
busy
know
job.
it. Very busy. So anyway, what's going on with our
Okay,
budget?
anyway, the old mayor did leave.
You visited the finance committee, didn't you?
Well, I've been to some of their meetings.
Yeah.
You can also watch them on Zoom, so you
Yep.
can follow it in different ways, and sometimes you get even stuff from reading articles about it that you
Mm-hmm.
don't pick up in the meetings. And just as a background, the mayor did leave. I'd call it a big turd. He left a $13 million budget shortfall
Mm-hmm.
from the current year's budget to the budget that will begin on July 1st. And that was left to the new mayor. Now, she took office on April 1st, but has to provide a budget to the city council by June 15th. That's by charter. So she really had 2.5 months. And it's hard enough to fill a gap like that. That was over 10% of the budget.
Really? Yeah.
And on top of that, I think as mayoral candidate, she intends to change things, to do things differently. But I don't know if I'm disappointed by it. I think it's just reality. In the time she had to prepare a budget, you weren't going to be able to have the time to make really considered fundamental changes to city government. There's just not the time. And in fact, the old mayor didn't even begin this an efficiency study to see where money could be saved. That study didn't even begin until he was out of office. He's the one who arranged for it at the end, but didn't leave her anything to work with. There were no tools to work with other than what you had available at the time. There was no way to change things in a fundamental way. So they made some choices. I don't know if they were really hard choices, but she tried to keep commitments she made during the campaign. I think she is very sensitive to keeping Burlington as a livable city. Livable meaning you
By
can
that,
afford
you
to
mean-
live here.
yeah, right.
For everybody. And first thing she said was she wants to make sure there's public safety. Now, the voters had voted for a 3-cent public safety tax increase.
Which means, what would that be?
Well,
For the police?
It's designated to be for police and fire, but what they really did, I think, was they just said we'll get more money for police and fire, and that money saved will go to funding other city departments. So it's kind of a bait and switch. People say, well, we could fund the police and fire with a special tax, but nothing says we have to. It isn't like these must be funded with a special tax. They don't have to have a special tax at all, but it was there. I remember when they first came up with it, the idea was to provide enhanced services for fire and police, not just to fund what's going on now, but to do something more. I don't think that's happening with this budget.
No?
I think it's basically you're substituting a tax for the police, and then that money that doesn't go to them any longer was going to go to other city departments. It did create more money. The old mayor wanted 5 cents. Eventually, they went with 3 cents, and Emma will go with 2 cents for now. She's really trying to hold the line on general city
Okay.
taxes. It's an old progressive principle that the worst tax is the property tax.
Uh-huh.
So that puts the greatest burden on the fewest people, the property tax. Because Burlington has, I used to think it was 40, but now they're saying up to 60% of the property is tax exempt. So that means 60% of the people living or working in Burlington aren't paying anything for police, aren't paying anything for fire.
Because they're property
It's a property
owners,
ta-
and
well-
some of those.
Well, they're not. They're property owners that are exempt.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So it's a
For
serious
one reason
problem.
or another.
Correct. But what it means is about 40 or 50% of the population pays the property tax, which supports most of city government.
Mm-hmm.
And then 50% who use the services still don't pay anything for it directly. So she's trying to limit the property tax increase, which I think is something that started back in Bernie days.
Yes, it
Property
did.
tax
Yeah, I
is the
remember
most
that.
unfair
Yeah.
tax.
So, but the idea then is for an income tax,
Well,
correct?
there's no time.
I know
there was no
that. I
time for
know
that.
it.
I think she is
I know.
on the campaign. She wants to see something, maybe something like the education tax, where it's income sensitive.
Uh-huh.
But
yeah.
there was no time to do that in the 2 months.
Right.
But I think you'll see that coming forward this year. The other thing they did was they raised the room meals tax from a 2-cent tax to a 4-cent tax.
Uh-huh.
They found some savings. An example, one office, the REIB office.
What is that?
That's racial equality,
Inclusion.
inclusion, and belonging.
And now that office was created when?
Moreau created it, I believe, in about 2020.
And where did the funds come from for
As
that
far as I
office?
know, it was just city revenues. There may have been some COVID money in there, but it was basically a city-funded department with the department head reporting to the mayor. But it's turned out to be a management disaster is all I can say. There's been all sorts of problems. The mayor, even though it was a direct report to him, just let it go to hell. And maybe it
Well,
wasn't all
right.
his fault, but it went from 12 people at one time down
12
to 4. Yeah,
And what were they in charge of?
I'm not sure. I know they were in charge of Juneteenth celebration
Which is coming up.
coming up, and there's other stuff.
In other
that-
words, no, but this was the city's response to people like who argued that the city was not paying attention enough to racial matters,
I
correct?
think it came about through the whole Black Lives Matter
Yes,
movement.
right,
This
that's
was the
right.
city's
That's what I
response
thought
to it.
too.
Correct.
Right,
It
right.
was, but it was just done in such a poor way and managed so poorly, and it's
And the leadership was always questionable, wasn't
questionable. And in fact, the last leader, I don't know if she's even fully. She said she was going to retire. I'm not sure, or resign. I'm not sure she's resigned yet, but she's never been there.
it? Never.
Apparently never, maybe once.
I
but
saw her once.
Literally never at the office. Was always on some kind of leave of some sort.
Wow.
Not running the office. Leaving
Maybe
it-
medical?
I think it was personal.
All right.
Leaving a lot for the few people that remaining to try and hold the fort. You got to give them credit for doing
Yep.
something. A lot of the staff was gone, so it was a very dysfunctional department. But the good news was there's money to be saved because he didn't have to pay all those staff, and the positions remain unfilled at the moment. And one of the ways the mayor is saving money in the future is right now any position that's vacant isn't going to be filled. They can change that during the year, and I imagine positions that become vacant up to some point will not be filled. But there's a limit to that. For instance, some places you got to have a person doing a job,
Right.
and maybe 2 people would be better, but you got to have at least 1.
Yeah.
So that was a savings. They also used the last of the one-time money, which I think really got us into a lot
And
of this
that was
mess.
COVID money?
COVID money.
Uh-huh.
I think they had about $5 million of that.
Uh-huh.
So that's in there. But that is the last time there'll be that kind of money. So you can see that if nothing changes, next year's budget already there's $5 million gap to be filled. And you're also at that point, your staffing is not probably what you want it to be. And that doesn't mean we have to fill all these positions. Maybe some of these positions, parts of department, who knows, maybe those aren't even really something we can afford to do anymore.
But it's a situation that the new mayor is going to have to
She's
deal
going to have to
with.
deal with. And
Right.
it's going to involve personnel. It's going to involve all sorts of changes. There's some type of a study out. We'll probably hear about it soon. It's this efficiency study. Now, I'd say it'd probably be okay, but I think there's probably going to be stuff more fundamental than efficiency that we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to make some decisions on, do we want something?
'Kay,
Not how we want to do it if we do it, but do we want it at all?
So, Steve, does all this news about the REIB, the Racial Equity Inclusion BIPOC, I think it all means, office will
Belonging.
be gone, and so that there won't be any attention paid in the new administration
That-
to these important questions?
That's not what the mayor says her intent is. She says it's important to her. What might happen is, though, if they're funded, let's say, for 12 people, but only 4
Yeah.
people are there now, so they've frozen those jobs, they may be let some of those jobs be filled. I think you'll probably see what I would say a smaller, more effective department. I don't know what else to call it. The commitment is there. I think the mayor believes it was probably overfunded, bloated bureaucracy. So smaller, leaner, meaner, but doing that job. It will not be eliminated. But yeah, I mean, you never know for sure. I doubt that's going to happen. But I could see somewhere in the city some parts of departments, never a whole department, parts of departments, some efforts, some things being discontinued in the future. Just saying it's nice that we could do it, but we can't do it anymore. And
Okay.
somehow that, I think, is the next year's challenge. What is the staff we can afford, and what can that staff do that we can afford them having them do? That's the challenge. That couldn't be done in 2 months, so that's the
All
future.
right, before we end this discussion, what about the school budget? Do you know anything
well,
about that?
That's the, if there ever was a gorilla in the room, it's the school budget. We voted I think we did in February again. We voted for coming year's school budget. And that was going to involve some significant increase in the school property tax for people living in Burlington. What it didn't have in it was, and it may have had a little bit of it in there in the budget, but the funding for the high school, the new high school, which is going to be over $200 million. And that, at least right now, we voted to spend it. We voted to spend a bond. But the school department has not been really out front explaining what it's going to cost to pay that back. And one of the reasons I say that is school taxes in Vermont, property taxes, are actually paid to the state. The state of Vermont then doles those out through their education funding program. And it's got something called income sensitivity, which means no
Right.
Vermonter is going to pay more than, I think it's something like 2.6% of your income. That's the most your property tax will be for the purpose of education taxes. And then there's a cap on that. If you earn enough, there's no cap anymore. So you've got that in the equation. And a lot of times in Burlington, when people are voting for the budget, the regular budget now, that cap is in their minds. In other words,
Yeah.
take in my case, I could vote for it. It's not going to cost me anymore. I'm income sensitive. I'm going to stay at that level. So it's an easy vote to say yes. I think a lot of people end up doing that. It's not costing them. But the school construction budget, that's a different animal. That I don't believe. And I've been trying to find out more about it. People have been asking. No one can get a straight answer. But school capital funding, construction, is not part of the income sensitive school tax.
That means we're all going to have to pay a whole
Possibly.
lot more.
But believe it or not, this date, it still can't get a straight answer and say what is going to be in there or not. But when you talk about school tax, and I have a brochure with me that the schools put out showing how much people would pay, it didn't include the school bond amount. It might have had a little bit for 1 year in there, the first year, but the big nut is about to hit, and that's going to be tough to deal with. And it may not be income sensitive. That's the thing that's kind of scary about
Which
it.
means that poor people
Will pay.
will pay more for the schools.
And then
correct?
remember, there's only 40 or 50% of the public property owners are actually paying this tax
Yes.
at all.
Yeah.
So it's the worst kind of situation. And maybe it turned out they will pay it. But I know I was reading something recently again about this issue. The state used to have a school construction program in the financing of schools. That was eliminated in 2007. So there has not been any support for school construction since then, except by special appropriations from the legislature. And in fact, the legislature, I believe, is providing some money to Burlington for the school to
High
deal
school.
high school
High
to deal
school.
specifically with this PCB issue. So that was a
Uh-huh.
special appropriation. It didn't come.
Right.
Maybe they took it out of the school funding. I'm not sure, but it was a special appropriation. If that hadn't been for that, there's nothing in the school tax program, property tax program, that would have funded that like they've done. So that was a special thing. But I don't believe they're participating at all in the rest of the school.
Okay.
And we're going to learn more about that. But that could be quite a
All right,
shock on top of
so-
everything else. And then maybe one more thing: there's electric rate shock coming also. Burlington Electric's getting, I believe, like a 12% increase, something
Oh, my
like that.
God.
So now the only thing good about that, I wouldn't say it's good or bad, and this is something that goes way back to the Birdie days, how they would try and do it. If you're going to try and raise money somehow, and Burlington Electric is part of the city, but it's separate. You can't just take Burlington Electric money and pay police with it. But if you're going to try and raise money, it's better to try and raise it through things like a gross receipts tax or
Rooms and meals.
something to do with rates and things like that, because everyone pays those. UVM pays those, for instance. That's what a big tax. There's an
Yeah.
outfit that doesn't pay any taxes.
Yeah.
They pay a little bit of what's called in
Right.
lieu of taxes, but they don't pay much. So if you can need money and you can get it somehow through electric rates, they pay that.
Wow.
They
yeah.
pay for
Right.
it. So
right.
that's
But so do we.
So do we. But everyone's in that
Right.
boat. In other words, you're sharing then.
Yeah.
If you go to the property tax, take UVM off the table. They're not participating.
I know.
And the rest
Right.
of us have to carry.
Neither are
the bill.
churches.
Churches, I think a lot of fraternities, state buildings, I believe, are exempt, but they do pay it in lieu of taxes. Interestingly enough, UVM, as I say, is the big exempt one. Champaign
Hospital, too.
College, hospitals, big one, but Champaign College is not tax exempt. They do pay taxes.
Well, they're private.
Well, they are, but I'm saying just
Yeah,
it
right.
doesn't even matter who you are. You're a private college doing good stuff. You're a public college doing good stuff.
I think
one's
that-
exempt, one isn't.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, thank you so much for that update, and we'll be looking for another update
There'll be
on
more.
the
I
budget
think, yeah.
situation
I mean,
soon.
it's ongoing. This is the year when
Uh-huh.
the budget, if she's going to change stuff, the mayor is going. This is the year that's going to evolve.
Okay,
So
great.
we'll have to see what happens.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you, Steve, and we'll see you soon. So with me right now is Pete Garitano. As I said, a man about town, drives around a lot in our city and has comments about what he sees. And he has a report today about one of our sports events, correct?
Correct.
What is it?
So, a couple Sundays ago, Burlington held its annual marathon, and I want to say close to 1,000 runners. I may be wrong there, but there were a lot of runners, and they had the normal prizes given for, I believe, for age and sex. And I believe the top 26 places were men. And out of the first 100, I think there might have been 7 women and 93
This is
men.
the marathon.
The marathon, I'm sorry, yeah, the marathon. The first place runner was probably 2 hours and 30 minutes, and the woman that came in pretty close at maybe 2 hours and 50, like 20 minutes behind the first place woman. And then a person came in 494th, an hour and a half behind the fastest time, and they were awarded a $2,400 prize. And so those that aren't familiar with what happened might ask, did this person have a disability? And no, they there's Special Olympics for people with disabilities. But what happened was this year, somebody in the marathon hierarchy decided to have a prize for people that were non-binary. So it's a very interesting term because
Yeah.
even when you go online, it's very ambiguous, but it's all about gender, not about sex, okay? And certainly we all know from years and years of sporting events that men are going to be a little faster, a little stronger, and any competition involving has to do with physical activities generally is going to be won by men. I mean, you can see in this race, like I said, 93 of the top 100 times were won by men. So my question is, why was a prize given to something that had nothing to do with physical ability? Okay, it had to do with how someone views themselves. You could say, well, should there be
So-
separate? Go ahead.
No, nothing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Should there be separate categories? I mean, some people believe that there's 72 genders, so we should have 72 different categories. I mean,
But others don't, right?
well, others don't.
Yeah.
But I mean, what it would in effect do, if you can see, let's look from the Times, is that more prizes would be given to men, because if you had enough people in there, all the awards, you say, or if you just had this thing and said, okay, well, we'll have no categories, which would be the opposite. The same thing would happen. You'd give all the prize money to men, and this would be unfair.
Because what your argument, I guess, would be is that men are physically stronger. Period. Correct.
Well, yeah,
Right?
it's not a real argument. It's a
Yeah.
fact.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
right.
a biological fact. I mean, men are on the average heavier, taller, stronger, more muscle mass. It's just the way it is. I mean, that's why they win these things. When I was growing up, it's a funny thing. I have very dark skin, and
You're Italian, correct?
I'm Italian,
Southern Italian.
but Southern Italian. But I went to a high school, believe it or not, in Delaware, Joe Biden State, where big high school, 1,500 kids. There were no actual black kids in our whole school. I was the darkest person in school, and I was treated as a black person.
You were? How so? What do you mean?
I had nicknames like Sambo, pretty bad. And I just put up with it. I mean, it's one of those things. What do you do, And
And what would you say? People called you that? Or
I
what?
just, what do you just let it? I mean, they were joking, but it was just the way it was. But because of my skin color, I never kind of viewed myself as a white person, because I'm obviously not white. And, when you would have those things in the old days, you'd have the box that would be Native American, white, black. I'd always felt like I can't, there's got to be
did you
other. Well, if there was other, I put other, but I would never.
Really?
Yeah, I would
And
never.
how many people?
Well, I would never check white. It didn't make sense. I mean,
Or black, or black.
But technically, I'm a white person or a Caucasian because I'm not black and I'm not Native
Well,
American.
you're not you don't have African descent,
Right,
is
right.
what you're saying,
DNA
right?
wise, right? DNA wise, I'm technically a white person, but I'm not. I couldn't go. Should I be able to go and say, all right, I've always felt like a black person. Should I be able to apply to college to special treatment that it's grants or money that's been set aside? And what we're dealing with here in this race is kind of the same thing in my mind, and it's happening in other sporting events, is that it's a women's rights thing, okay? Because women, if there's a certain amount of prize money and you're going to award the prize money in a physical event to something other than physicality, something that's in somebody's mind. I've always felt like a black person. Well, this doesn't change how fast I run, okay? I'm not really sure, I don't identify with being a man or a woman. Well, it has nothing to do with physicality.
It has nothing to do with sex either.
Oh, with sex, right. So you are either a man or a woman. That's determined at conception.
That's genetics, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's conception. They can find out in your womb with an ultrasound. So, and so the man is going to be faster, stronger, jump higher, all these things. But if you award extra prize monies that things that have nothing to do with sex, eventually it's going to all go to men because that's just what's going to happen. Because so next year, if they have the marathon again, it wasn't big news, but if they have the marathon again and they still have a category that has nothing to do with sex,
Or physical ability, really.
or physical
Right.
ability, ultimately there'll be con men come along that'll say, well, I'm not good enough to win the men's race. I came in 50th last year, but I certainly will win the non-binary race and I'll collect the $2,400. It's not small change. I mean, and that kind of stuff is happening in other areas that we read about, that, they're putting men in women's prisons and women are getting hurt. They're having men play in women's sporting events because they say they're women, and so it's not happening in the other direction. People are getting hurt, taking away
But you don't
prize money.
see then a woman going to play male basketball, for instance.
Because
correct?
Caitlin Clark isn't going to sign up with the Lakers anytime soon. The new superstar for the.
She's so great.
She's great. She's
is.
great, but she wouldn't score a point in the NBA.
Is that right?
Oh yeah.
Why?
Because
she's not tall enough?
She's not tall enough. She's not fast enough. She's not strong enough. She would never get off a shot.
And she doesn't try to either.
Well, no, she wouldn't try to. But it's only happening in the other direction,
Including swimming, right?
including swimming. Leah Thomas
Who won the championship?
won the championship. And somebody's got to put a stop to this because it's just hurting women. It's not happening the other way. Women aren't entering men's sports. Women aren't saying, hey, I want to go into a men's prison because I feel like a man and raping men. Okay, it's not happening. And it's hurting women. It's not, and this ideology or whatever it is. And I have nothing against people who feel different than other people. It has nothing to do with that. Bernie sent out a letter. I just got an email about protecting women's rights to have an abortion. And to me, this is at least as powerful or more powerful.
There's a lot of women who are also arguing in your direction.
Oh, yeah.
Women athletes, young women athletes,
yeah.
who are saying this has got to
It's wrong,
stop.
yeah.
Right?
And in fact, there's a lot of
No, I know.
Yeah, there's a lot of lesbian, gay, bisexual that kind of want to distance themselves in this particular category too, that don't agree with it. Certainly, the most famous of all, Bruce Jenner, does not believe that men should be playing in women's sports. So
It's a very controversial
it's a
topic.
controversial issue, and I
Yeah.
hope next year that the race excludes this category because it's not fair.
There's a very powerful argument. I don't know who's going to win the argument.
Well-
However, that if a man feels that they were born really in the wrong body that they should be treated as women. That is the other argument, correct?
That's
Gender,
fine.
but I wouldn't use, it's a gender argument in that way, but it certainly isn't based on sex.
Right.
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 There seems
We
to be
can- you can
there
prove
seems to be a real distinction between gender and sex.
Well, you can't. You can prove somebody's sex very easily, but you can't prove
Right.
what's in their head.
Yeah, right. That's
so
true.
what are
Right.
they going to do when next year, say, there's 100 people that enter that all say they're non-binary? They can't give them a blood test. They can't get. What are they
Right.
going to give them, a lie detector test? I mean, there's no way to
know.
determine. Somebody could be one day, and then after the race, they're going, just kidding, right? Yeah.
Yes,
So
well-
it's.
It's a very controversial subject, so I thank you for bringing it up. Okay, thanks for being here, Pete.
right.
More next month.
Nearly 10,000 heroes buried side by side, officers and enlisted, immigrants and native-born, different races, different faiths, but all Americans. All served with honor when America and the world needed them most. Millions back home did their part as well. From coast to coast, Americans found countless ways to pitch in. They understood our democracy is only as strong as all of us make it together. The men who fought here became heroes, not because they were the strongest or toughest or were fiercest, although they were, but because they were given an audacious mission, knowing, every one of them knew, the probability of dying was real. But they did it anyway. They knew, beyond any doubt, there are things that are worth fighting and dying for.
This is June 6th of 2024. On June 6th, 1944, many, many years ago, the United States, with its allies, particularly the Canadians, entered Europe to liberate Western Europe from the occupation by the Nazis or by the Germans or the German Nazis who were occupying Western Europe as we were involved in World War II. It's a very important day because that was the day, essentially, that World War II began to close and end, at least on the Western Front. The war continued, however, in Asia, particularly with the United States, battles against the Japanese Empire. But I'm here today to talk a little bit about the importance of that day in history and what it meant, not only for the end of World War II in Europe, but also what it really meant for the future of the world, really. So Eric was going to ask me some questions about that.
This is the charm of our programs. 1 second you could be interviewing and being interviewed.
Right.
This is a collective of reporters, citizen journalists that go around the city, but the states and maybe the world to bring issues that are pertinent to our lives.
To our lives, right.
Yep. Sandy, my first question would be: how did the success of D-Day shape the post-World War?
It was so important to remember something. On D-Day in 1944, the United States was allies with the Soviet Union. So this was not just the liberation of Western Europe. The Russians were very active in liberating Eastern Europe as well. Remember that in June 1941, the Soviet Union was attacked by Germany. And at that point, the Americans, the British, and the French were allies of Russia in that attack.
We don't say that much,
No,
that
we never
Russia
talk-
was an ally. It
Right.
looks like
How
the
many people
Americans,
know that?
the GIs, the boys just came to liberate Europe. That's
Right.
it. But we don't get into the details.
Nor do we ever talk about the fact, and I taught history for a long time, that the Soviet Union was our chief ally at the time. So the Allied forces were the U.S., France was occupied, of
Yeah,
course.
France was occupied,
So
yeah.
main allies were the U.S., the U.K., and Soviet Russia. On the Eastern Front, it was Russia who had been invaded by the Germans, and Russia who were fighting back against the German Nazis.
The Russians lost
The Russia in that war, and remember that attack was 1941. The Germans attacked Russia. And by the way, Russia was called then the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It was a communist country. Okay, so Russia was attacked by Germany in June 41. Russia, of course, had to defend itself, right? And so Russia then began to fight with the Nazis and with the Germans to defend itself, number one, but also to beat them so that they were gone essentially from Europe. The Nazis, not the German people, but the Nazis were gone from Europe essentially.
So all of a sudden, the Russians become the enemies.
There's another fact to that. And the Russians, of course, were our allies in World War I as well, because the United States, Britain, and France have always needed the Russians to beat the Germans. World War I against Germany. World War II, we were involved in a fight with Germany. On the Eastern Front, Russia has been always our ally, not our enemy. Now, all of a sudden, they're our enemy again. But World War I, World War II, the allies who were together to beat Germany were the UK, the U.S., and Russia.
But right after the war,
I
the
know,
Russians
and
became
that's the point.
enemies.
And that's the point.
What is the reason?
That's
What
the
was the
point.
reason?
I want to make another point, though, about the liberation of Europe on our part, which was real. The United States, of course, were successful in liberating Western Europe. But at the same time, the Russians were engaged in liberating Eastern Europe. So guess where those troops met? In 1944, 45, American troops entering the West, Russian troops entering the East. They met in Berlin and hugged each other and celebrated that the Nazis were finally gone. Together.
And what happened?
Together. Immediately, again, the United States, I think, and of course this is controversial, other people think the Russians started it, but immediately the Cold War begins. And I'll give you the perfect example of that. Okay, there was a new world order. Guess who won World War II? The only power that could say it won, really, was which one?
The Russians?
No.
No, I mean United States. World
Right.
War One, or
Both.
two, both. Yeah.
Both. Okay, so the Russians, you could argue that they were successful in their because they caused the Germans to be gone, or the Nazis.
But it could be a matter of perspective and
Yes.
propaganda,
Yes.
because the Russian can say we also
I'll
won.
I know. I'm saying two things. One, the United States clearly liberated Western Europe from the Nazi occupation with the Canadians.
With the
And with
British
yes.
also. So
Okay.
is it
those
the
three?
U.S. or it's a coalition?
Those three liberated Western Europe.
Okay.
But in the East, who liberated the Eastern Europeans?
The Russian.
The Soviets.
So Sandy, right now, it's
I want to mention one other thing. 22 million Russians died.
So
Right.
they pay the highest price.
They paid the highest price.
Okay, Sandy, today, how does the situation 80 years ago resemble what we're seeing today?
All right,
Are
I'll
we
tell you how.
going towards a third world war?
Yeah, against the
now
Russians.
Friends becoming enemies.
Against the Russians. Okay, and I'll tell you why it begins in 44 and 45. In 47, guess what alliance was formed? NATO.
NATO, yeah?
North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a new alliance now. Guess who's not included? The Russians.
The Russians, yeah.
The original alliance were the victors of World War II. The French, the English, the Americans, and the Canadians, okay? That was the new alliance. Who was the enemy of that alliance?
Russia, I mean USSR.
So,
yeah, the Soviet.
call it what it was, the Soviet
The
Union,
Union.
because it's important.
Yeah. So are we going towards another world war?
You tell me. Because the war in Ukraine, one of the reasons that war has broken out is that Ukraine, under Zelensky in particular, wants to be in NATO, wants to be a part of that Western alliance. Who is the alliance aimed at in 44.
But I mean, aimed at the Soviet Union. But
Yeah.
Sandy, today we're living and we're running out of time. We're living in a multipolar
Yes.
world.
Yes.
So
Yeah, right, you're absolutely right.
can we face the same contradiction between ones like East
Yes,
against West?
it's the same because
Now you have also the global South.
you can-
There's an
right.
implication of different
can
allies.
argue. You
Yeah.
can argue one way or another about Ukraine, but you cannot, I don't think, argue with the fact that NATO has always been an alliance against Russia and an alliance that Russia and Vladimir Putin.
Did we
fear.
really learn from all these wars that torn Europe and the world apart?
Are you kidding?
It looks like we didn't. But Sandy, the world is still a beautiful place to live.
Oh
in.
yeah, sure.
And today, as Jazz Fest is starting in Burlington, I came across a nice little students band that was, interpreting this wonderful tune. What a wonderful world.
But that was Louis
Yeah,
Armstrong.
yes, and then
I agree.
that's how we're gonna finish this.
Wait a minute, I want one other point about this.
Okay.
I believe we're involved, and it's a disputable claim that we are once again threatening World War III with the NATO advances toward Russia.
Let's hope that human
Let's
beings.
hope I'm wrong.
Let's hope that you're wrong
Yeah.
and human beings
Yes.
realize that we live in
It's
a
a
beautiful
wonderful
world,
yeah,
a
yeah.
wonderful world that is
Okay.
worth
I'll
being
leave
preserved.
you with that thought.
What a wonderful world.
Not
Bye-bye.
bad. Not bad.
That was Voices of Vermont. See you next time.
Yeah. See you next time.